Not just a name, not just a face on a screen, but a feeling, a mirror. Something the rest of us hold up when we're trying to understand our own quiet sadness, our own stubborn kindness, our own desperate need to believe that a person can go through the worst kind of pain and still come out the other side, still intact, still gentle. Keanu Reeves is that kind of person. For decades, people have watched him, not just his films, his life. The way he takes the subway without a single bodyguard, sitting among strangers like he has nowhere more important to be. The way photographers catch him on park benches, alone, looking out at nothing in particular, looking like a man who carries something the rest of the world can't quite see. The internet decided he was sad, then it decided he was kind, then it decided he was both at once, and somehow that combination made him feel more real than almost any celebrity alive. But here's the thing that nobody could quite explain. The more famous he became, the less he actually said. He gave interviews, he showed up to events. He smiled into cameras with a warmth that felt genuine. But there was always something in the way, something invisible, perfectly placed, warm enough that nobody could call it cold, but solid enough that the real conversation never quite happened. And then something changed. At 60 years old, after a lifetime of careful silence, Keanu Reeves began to speak differently. Not loudly, not in some dramatic headline-grabbing confession. But slowly, deliberately, the way a man speaks when he has finally made peace with something that once felt too dangerous to say out loud. What he admitted wasn't a scandal. It wasn't the kind of secret the tabloids chase. It was quieter than that, and because of that somehow it hit so much harder. Because what he finally said is what millions of people had already felt, watching him, wondering about him, seeing themselves in him, without ever being able to find the right words for it themselves. To understand what Keanu Reeves finally admitted at 60, you can't start with the fame. You can't start with the films or the franchise or the magazine covers. You have to go back further than all of that, back to before the world knew his name. Back to when he was just a boy, small and watchful, in a life that never quite stayed still long enough for him to feel safe inside it. He was born in Beirut in 1964. His father was Hawaiian Chinese. His mother was English. By the time he was 3 years old, his parents had already separated, and his father, by most accounts, was drifting in and out of his life with an unpredictability that a small child can't understand and can never quite recover from. His mother moved and then moved again, Australia, New York. Then Canada, where Keanu would spend most of his childhood, mostly in Toronto, mostly adjusting to yet another new place, yet another new start. By the time he was a teenager, he had already attended 4 different high schools. 4, there was no anchor, no place he could point to and say with any real certainty, this is where I belong. He was quiet. People who knew him then described not shyness exactly, but something more precise than that, a watchfulness. The particular stillness of a child who has learned, early and thoroughly, that the world can change without any warning, and that it is safer to observe than to assume. He struggled in school. Dyslexia made the whole experience feel like a wall he kept running directly into, no matter how hard he tried. But then he found theater. And something about standing on a stage, slipping into someone else's skin, giving a voice to emotions that had no other place to go, made a kind of sense that nothing else in his life had managed to make. He moved to Los Angeles in his early 20s. He had almost nothing. For a period, he slept in his car. He took the small roles, the forgettable scenes, the kind of work that strips away any illusion you might have about how glamorous any of this actually is. The kind of work that humbles you quietly before it builds you slowly. And then, in 1989, Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure came out, and suddenly, everywhere you looked, there was his face. But fame, when it finally arrived, did not come the way people imagine it does. Clean and bright and simple, it arrived tangled. It arrived at the same time as other things, darker things, things that were already quietly beginning to break beneath the surface. What most people have never fully understood, even those who have followed every chapter of his life, is that the version of Keanu the world fell in love with was also a man quietly accumulating a weight of loss that would have bent most people permanently out of shape. He didn't talk about it then, he barely talks about it now even all these years later. But at 60, something in the way he let the world look at him began to open, not completely, but enough. Just enough to finally see what had been there the whole time, sitting quietly underneath every role, every public appearance, every photograph of him alone on a bench, looking like the loneliest man on earth. There is a version of Keanu Reeves that the public assembled for themselves, piece by piece over many years, It was built from fragments. A paparazzi photo here, a Reddit thread there. A viral story about something kind he did that he never intended anyone to find out about. The internet decided he was sad, then it decided he was good. Then it decided he was both at the same time in a way that felt almost unbearably human, and that combination stuck, because it rang true in a way that most celebrity narratives simply don't. He never leaned into any of it, he never corrected much of it either. He simply kept moving through the world in that quiet, unhurried way of his, doing the work. Showing up without the performance that almost everyone else at his level of fame feels compelled to maintain. Colleagues who have worked with him across decades describe him in almost identical terms, no matter the production, no matter the year. Generous, present, focused without being tense. There are stories, many of them verified long after the fact by crew members who had no reason to invent them, of him giving away substantial portions of his salary so that the people working below the line could be paid better. Of refusing a private trailer so that money could go elsewhere. Of making it his business to know the name of every single person on set before filming ever began, not as a gesture, but as a practice, a genuine one. None of this was designed for cameras. Most of it surfaced only years later, in interviews with people who still seemed slightly amazed by it. And yet, even with all of that, there was still something unreachable about him. Something that couldn't quite be touched, no matter how close the conversation got. He spoke about his craft with real intelligence. He spoke about philosophy, about Dostoevsky and Sartre and Buddhist ideas he had clearly spent genuine time with, not to sound interesting. But because the questions those thinkers raised were questions he actually lived inside. You could hear it in the way he talked. The ease of someone who reads because the alternative is to stop thinking, and stopping thinking is not something he knows how to do. But the moment any conversation edged toward the personal, toward the losses, toward the enormous cumulative grief that anyone paying attention already knew was there, he would slow down. His words would come more carefully, and then, with a gentleness that made it almost impossible to push back, he would redirect. For years, that felt like privacy. Like a man protecting something sacred, which was his right. What it actually was, and what he would only begin to name clearly when he reached his 60s, was something more layered than privacy alone. It was a man who was still, even then, still learning how to hold certain truths without being taken apart by them. In 1993, Keanu Reeves lost his closest friend. River Phoenix died outside a nightclub in Los Angeles. He was 23 years old, Keanu was 29. They had been the kind of close that is hard to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. The kind of friendship that forms between two people who recognize something in each other that neither of them can quite put into words. River Phoenix was, by most accounts, one of the very few people Keanu had ever truly let past that invisible wall he carried everywhere. And then he was gone, in a single night. Keanu didn't speak about it publicly for years. When he was finally asked, his answers were short. He said he was devastated. And then he moved forward, the way he always moved forward, quietly, without turning his grief into something for others to consume. Then in 1999, his girlfriend Jennifer Syme gave birth to their daughter. They had named her Ava. She was stillborn, full term, there and then not there before she ever had a chance to arrive. 18 months after that, Jennifer was killed in a car accident on Mulholland Drive. 2 losses, layered on top of each other, both the kind that don't have language adequate enough to hold them. And at exactly this moment in his life, The Matrix was released. Keanu Reeves became the biggest action star on the planet overnight. His face was on every screen, every magazine, every billboard. He was Neo, he was the chosen one. He was power and grace and invincibility made flesh. The contrast is almost too painful to sit with quietly. Here was a man privately absorbing a level of grief that most people will never come close to experiencing in an entire lifetime, and simultaneously being asked to be a symbol of strength. To wear black and move through bullet time and embody a character who could not be broken, while privately carrying something that had absolutely no cinematic resolution. He showed up. He made the sequels, he did the press tour. He smiled into cameras for years, and he said almost nothing true about any of it, not because he was cold. Not because he was performing some kind of toughness. But because, as he would eventually admit much later, he genuinely did not yet know how to speak what was real without coming completely undone in front of the world. And coming undone in front of the world at that moment would have felt like one loss too many to survive. For a long time, people read Keanu's silence as depth, and they weren't wrong. It was depth. But it was also armor, and those two things are not the same even when they look identical from the outside. Depth is what you carry. Armor is what you wear so no one can see the weight of what you're carrying. Both can exist in the same person at the same time, and from a distance, they are almost impossible to tell apart. His choices as an actor in the years that followed those losses tell a story of their own if you know how to read them. He kept gravitating toward characters who exist outside ordinary emotional life, men who are defined at their core by what they have lost. John Wick, the franchise that became the great success of his later career, is at its heart a story about a man who cannot stop grieving. A man who channels everything inward-facing outward, because the alternative, turning it fully inward, has become something he can no longer survive. Keanu has never said this explicitly, but he has said in quiet moments in various interviews that he understands John Wick in a way that goes beyond craft. That something about that specific devastation, that particular shape of loss, feels genuinely familiar to him. Away from the screen, smaller signals kept appearing for those paying close attention. He spoke here and there across years about the nature of grief, not in grand statements. In careful, measured sentences, dropped almost experimentally into longer conversations, as if testing whether the air could hold the weight of them. He talked about how grief doesn't end, how it changes its shape slowly over time but never fully lives. How there are mornings, even now, even decades after the worst of it, when it arrives again without warning, and the only thing you can do is find a way to be with it, instead of fighting it back. And then came Alexandra Grant. In late 2019, Keanu walked into a public event holding her hand. She was an artist, someone he had known and collaborated with for years. She had silver hair and a quiet confidence, and she was nothing like the partner the tabloids would ever have invented for him. The public reaction was something unexpected. People weren't shocked in the scandalous sense. They were moved because what they saw looked real, it looked chosen. It looked like something belonging to an actual life, rather than a life constructed for appearances. It looked like a man who had, after a very long time, finally decided that he was allowed to have something. And for people who had been watching him for decades, something in that moment quietly shifted. The conversations that finally changed how people understood Keanu Reeves didn't happen all at once. There was no single interview, no single moment of revelation. It happened across years slowly, as journalists and documentarians who were granted rare access began to notice something different in the way he was speaking. He was still measured, still precise. Still the man who chose every word with unusual care. But there was something new underneath it, a willingness to stay inside the difficult questions instead of gently steering away from them. He began to talk about grief differently, not as an event that happened and then ended, but as a permanent feature of the internal landscape. He used that phrase, interior landscape. It was the language of someone who had spent a very long time alone with their own mind, learning the geography of it. Learning where the difficult places were and how to move through them without being swallowed. He talked about loneliness, and he was careful about how he did it. He didn't present it as a wound or a complaint. He presented it as a fact, a real and significant fact of his life that he had, over a very long time, made a kind of peace with. He said that he had learned to be a good friend to himself. That the process of learning that had taken far longer than he would have liked. That he was genuinely not sure he could have managed it at 40 or even at 50. He talked about fame with a new kind of specificity, about what it gives and what it quietly takes. About the particular loneliness of living a life that is constantly surrounded by attention and almost never truly seen. About the difficulty of trusting people when you can never be entirely certain whether they are responding to you or to the version of you they have constructed in their own minds. And then came the moment that stopped people. He talked about happiness, not to say he had found it exactly, but to say that he had stopped waiting for it in the form he had once imagined it would arrive. That somewhere along the way, he had discovered something quieter. Something more reliable than happiness in its usual bright sense, a kind of internal steadiness, a way of waking up in the morning and being, as he put it very simply, genuinely okay. For anyone who had watched his life across decades, who had witnessed the losses and the silence and the years of carrying something immense, and carrying it without complaint, without performance, without asking for anything. That word landed with unusual force. Okay, such a simple word, such an ordinary word, and somehow coming from him in that specific context, it was the most powerful thing he had ever said publicly. There is something distinct about the honesty that belongs to 60. It is different in quality and texture from the honesty of earlier years. At 30, when you tell the truth, it is often because something in you is raw and angry and brave in the reckless way that youth allows. At 40, you tell it because you are simply too tired to keep maintaining the alternative. At 50, you tell it carefully, still holding the door closed on certain rooms. But at 60, if you have done the real internal work, and Keanu Reeves, in his unhurried and unannounced way, appears to have done an enormous amount of it. You tell the truth because the fear of what it might cost you has finally, quietly, loosened its grip. He speaks about Alexandra Grant with an openness that has no precedent in his public life. About having found, in the second half of his life, a partnership that is built on something real. On mutual respect, on a shared creative world, on the kind of genuine companionship that has nothing to perform for anyone. He doesn't discuss it often. He doesn't make it a centerpiece of his public identity. But when it does come up, there is a warmth in how he talks about it that is entirely different from anything in his earlier years. The warmth of someone who is no longer simply surviving, but actually living something. He has talked about his mother. About the complexity of that relationship, and about the particular uncertainty that moving constantly through childhood leaves inside a person. The low-grade, persistent feeling of never quite belonging anywhere, of being present in rooms without ever fully landing in them. He has talked about getting older with something that sounds, remarkably, like relief, not the anxiety that most people at his level of fame bring to conversations about aging. Something closer to the opposite, as though the years accumulating have made him more himself, more settled, more capable of recognizing his own life when he looks at it directly. He said that for most of his life he felt like he was moving through the world at a slight remove, present but not fully arrived. Engaged but always behind something invisible, something like glass that he couldn't quite name or locate or remove. And that in recent years something in him has finally arrived. Not at a destination, he is careful about that. He does not claim to have resolved anything or concluded anything or become anything finished, but arrived at himself. At a version of his own life that he can look at directly without needing to look away. There is a reason people have always projected so much of themselves onto Keanu Reeves. It isn't simply the losses, though those have been real and they have been enormous. It isn't simply the kindness, though that too appears to be genuine in a way that is increasingly rare in the world he inhabits. It is something more precise than either of those things. It is the fact that he never pretended. He never dressed his pain up as something more photogenic. He never turned his grief into content. He never performed his resilience for an audience that would have rewarded him generously for doing so. He simply kept going, quietly, steadily. Without asking anyone to notice, and without asking anyone to applaud. In a world that rewards volume above almost everything else, there is something genuinely moving about a person who refuses, consistently and without drama, to be loud about their own suffering. What he admitted at 60 is not a revelation in the way that word usually gets used. There is no secret finally exposed. There is no scandal finally surfaced. There is no plot twist at the end of the story. What he admitted is simpler than any of that, and because of that simplicity it carries more weight. He admitted that it was hard. That it took a very long time. That grief does not go away, but that it can, with enough time and enough willingness to sit with it, become something you live alongside rather than something that lives in your place. And that somewhere inside a life that has held more genuine difficulty than most people will ever encounter, he found his way. Slowly, without a map. Without any guarantee that he would make it through to the other side of it, to something that belongs to him, something that is actually honestly his own. That is not a small thing. For anyone who has ever carried something heavy, and carried it quietly, and carried it for far longer than anyone around them ever knew, it might be the most important thing. There is no clean ending to a life that is still unfolding, and Keanu Reeves has never pretended there was. He has never offered the world a tidy conclusion to a story that isn't finished yet. What he has finally offered after all this time is simply the truth of it, unpolished, unhurried, human, and in the end, quietly and completely, that is enough. If something in this stayed with you, let it. You don't need to rush past it or explain it or turn it into something useful immediately. Some stories don't ask you to do anything. They just ask you to feel something real for a moment, which is rarer than it sounds. If you'd like to see more stories told this way, carefully, honestly, without the noise, consider subscribing and leaving a thought in the comments. Not necessarily about Keanu. About whatever this brought up for you, those are always the conversations worth having.